My sister-in-law sabotaged my dress because I stole her friend's man, so I let my mother-in-law expose her in front of 200 guests, and she left in tears and disgrace. I never thought that falling in love with the right person could make me the enemy of an entire family. Until I met Michael Matthews and discovered that his heart was supposedly already promised to someone else. My name is Charlotte Evans, I'm 29 years old, and I work as a freelance graphic designer. 3 years ago, I met Michael at a coffee shop in downtown Portland where I was working on a client project. He was sitting at the table next to mine, struggling with what looked like architectural blueprints, muttering under his breath about measurements that didn't add up. When his coffee spilled across his papers, I offered him some napkins and ended up helping him salvage his work. That simple act of kindness turned into a 2-hour conversation, then dinner, then the most beautiful relationship I'd ever experienced. Michael was everything I'd ever wanted in a partner. Kind, intelligent, ambitious, and surprisingly funny once you got past his initial shyness. He worked as a civil engineer for a construction company, designing bridges and infrastructure projects that would outlast both of us. We bonded over our shared perfectionism, our love for old movies, and our dreams of traveling the world together. Within 6 months, we were inseparable. Within a year, we were living together. And after 2 years of the most natural, effortless love I'd ever known, he proposed to me on the same spot where we'd first met. I thought I was the luckiest woman alive. I had no idea I was walking into a war zone. The first time I met Michael's family, I noticed something strange immediately. His mother, Margaret Matthews, was polite but distant, greeting me with the kind of smile you'd give a stranger at the grocery store. His father, Robert, was warmer but seemed confused, as if he couldn't quite figure out who I was or why I was there. But it was his younger sister, Veronica, who made the biggest impression, and not in a good way. Veronica Matthews was 26, 3 years younger than me, and worked as an administrative assistant at a real estate company. She was petite and blonde with sharp green eyes that seemed to cut right through you when she looked at you. From the moment Michael introduced us, I could feel her hostility radiating across the room like heat from a furnace. She barely acknowledged my existence, answering my attempts at conversation with one-word responses and looking at me like I was something unpleasant she'd stepped in. "So, Charlotte," she'd said during that first dinner, her voice dripping with false sweetness, "Michael never mentioned you before. How long have you two been, whatever this is?" Michael had squeezed my hand under the table. "We've been together for 8 months, Ronnie. I've told you about Charlotte dozens of times. Have you?" Veronica had tilted her head, feigning confusion. "I must have forgotten. I suppose I was thinking about Emma." "You remember Emma, don't you, Michael? She asks about you all the time." The temperature at the dinner table seemed to drop 10 degrees. Margaret Matthews suddenly became very interested in her mashed potatoes, and Robert cleared his throat uncomfortably. Michael's jaw tightened in a way I'd never seen before. "Emma's doing well," he'd said carefully. "But she's not relevant to this conversation, isn't she?" Veronica had smiled, but it wasn't a pleasant expression. "I mean, we all thought... Well, never mind what we thought." That was my introduction to the shadow that would haunt my entire relationship with Michael's family. Emma Rodriguez, Veronica's best friend since childhood, and apparently the woman everyone had expected Michael to marry. Over the following months, as our relationship deepened and talk of marriage began, I started to piece together the full story. Emma had been part of the Matthews family since she was 10 years old, when her parents died in a car accident and she'd moved in with her grandmother who lived next door. Margaret Matthews had essentially adopted her as a second daughter, and Emma had spent more time in the Matthews house than her own. She'd grown up alongside Michael and Veronica, attending family vacations, birthday parties, and holiday celebrations as if she were blood. More importantly, Emma had been quietly, desperately in love with Michael for most of their lives. Everyone knew it, except Michael himself. Emma had never confessed her feelings, instead watching from the sidelines as he dated other girls throughout high school and college, always believing that eventually he'd realize she was the one for him. Margaret Matthews had certainly hoped so. She'd made no secret of the fact that she considered Emma the perfect daughter-in-law, often commenting on how well Emma knew the family, how she'd fit in so naturally, how wonderful their children would be. Veronica had been Emma's biggest cheerleader in this unrequited love story, constantly trying to push them together, arranging situations where they'd be alone, dropping hints to Michael about Emma's feelings. When Michael graduated from college and moved back home for a few months before starting his engineering job, Veronica had been certain that this would finally be when he and Emma got together. Instead, Michael had met me. The realization that I'd unknowingly stolen Emma's destiny explained everything about Veronica's behavior toward me. In her mind, I wasn't just her brother's girlfriend. I was the interloper who had ruined her best friend's life and disrupted the family's carefully laid plans. Every family gathering became a minefield of passive-aggressive comments, pointed questions about my intentions, and not-so-subtle references to how much better Emma would fit into their family dynamics. "Emma makes the most amazing apple pie," Margaret would say while I was helping with dinner. "She learned from my mother's recipe. It's been in our family for generations." "Emma always loved our family camping trips," Robert would mention when Michael and I were planning a vacation. "She knows all the best hiking trails up at the lake house." "Emma's so thoughtful," Veronica would add. "She always remembers everyone's birthdays, everyone's favorite foods. She just has this way of knowing what people need." The subtext was always clear. Emma belonged here, and I didn't. But Michael seemed oblivious to all of it, or maybe he was just choosing to ignore it. When I tried to bring up the family's obvious preference for Emma, he'd brush off my concerns. "They just need time to get to know you," he'd say. "Emma's been around forever. It's natural that they'd mention her sometimes. It doesn't mean anything. Your sister hates me, Michael. Ronnie's just protective. She'll come around." But Veronica didn't come around. If anything, her hostility intensified as our relationship progressed. She found increasingly creative ways to make me uncomfortable, forgetting to invite me to family events, sharing inside jokes and memories that pointedly excluded me, and always finding ways to bring Emma into every conversation. The breaking point came when Michael proposed. He'd planned the most romantic proposal I could have imagined, taking me back to that same coffee shop where we'd met, getting down on one knee right next to the table where we'd first talked. The ring was perfect, a vintage Art Deco design that reflected my love for classic aesthetics. I said yes before he'd even finished asking the question, and we spent the rest of the evening calling our friends and family to share the news. Michael called his parents first. I could hear his father's enthusiastic congratulations through the phone, but his mother's response was more muted. When he asked to speak to Veronica, I watched his face fall. "What do you mean she left?" he'd said. "She just left? Did she say where she was going?" After he hung up, Michael looked troubled. "Mom said Ronnie got upset when she heard the news and drove off. She's probably at Emma's." That night, I couldn't sleep. Something about Veronica's reaction felt ominous, like a storm cloud gathering on the horizon. I kept thinking about the way she'd looked at me during our last family dinner, how her eyes had narrowed when Michael mentioned we were getting serious about our future together. I was right to be worried. Over the next few months, as we planned our wedding, Veronica's sabotage attempts became more frequent and more obvious. She accidentally gave the wrong date to several family members, causing confusion about the wedding timeline. She suggested vendors who turned out to be unreliable or overpriced. She constantly questioned our choices, from the venue to the flowers to the menu, always with comments about how Emma would have done things differently. "Emma's always loved peonies," she'd say when I showed her photos of our floral arrangements. "She thinks roses are so predictable." "Emma's vegetarian," she'd mention when we were discussing the dinner menu. "She's always been so conscious about ethical eating. I'm surprised you went with beef for the main course." "Emma has such classic taste," she'd observe when I tried on my wedding dress for the family. "She's always said she'd want something simple and elegant, not so ornate." Every comment was designed to make me feel like I was making the wrong choices. Like Emma would have been a better bride, a better fit for their family, a better choice for Michael. But I was determined not to let Veronica's negativity ruin what should have been the happiest time of my life. The wedding was scheduled for a Saturday in late September, with the ceremony in a beautiful botanical garden and the reception at a historic mansion nearby. I'd spent months planning every detail, from the ivory and gold color scheme to the vintage-inspired decorations. My dress was a stunning creation by a local designer, a fitted bodice with delicate lace sleeves and a flowing silk skirt that made me feel like a princess. Everything was perfect. Everything was ready. And then, 2 days before the wedding, I discovered what Veronica had done. I'd gone to the bridal shop for my final fitting, excited to see how the last-minute alterations had turned out. The seamstress, Mrs. Chen, met me at the door with a concerned expression that immediately made my stomach drop. "Miss Evans," she said carefully, "I'm afraid there's been a problem with your dress." She led me to the back room where my wedding dress was hanging, and I gasped in horror. The beautiful silk skirt was stained with dark patches that looked like they'd been deliberately poured on the fabric. But worse than that, when Mrs. Chen lifted the skirt, I could see that the lining had been cut, not torn accidentally, but carefully sliced with scissors in multiple places, making the dress completely unwearable. "When did this happen?" I whispered, reaching out to touch the ruined fabric with trembling fingers. "I discovered it this morning when I came in to do your final steaming," Mrs. Chen said. "The shop was locked, and there were no signs of a break-in. I can only assume it happened yesterday evening after we closed. Who had access to the shop yesterday?" Mrs. Chen looked uncomfortable. "Well, you had authorized several people to pick up items for you, your maid of honor, your mother. And I believe someone came by yesterday afternoon claiming to be your future sister-in-law. A young blonde woman? She said she needed to check something about the bustle, and you had called ahead to approve it." My blood turned to ice. "Did she give you a name? Veronica, I think? She seemed to know all the details about the dress, and she had your phone number when I called to verify. She was only in the back room for a few minutes. I felt like I was going to be sick. Veronica had actually done this. She had deliberately destroyed my wedding dress 2 days before my wedding, knowing there would be no time to fix it or find a replacement. I called the number Veronica had given Mrs. Chen, but it went straight to voicemail, a generic message that didn't identify the caller. When I tried her real number, it was turned off. She'd planned this carefully, covering her tracks and making sure she couldn't be reached immediately. Mrs. Chen was apologetic but realistic. "I'm so sorry, Miss Evans, but there's no way to repair this kind of damage in time for Saturday. The stains have set into the silk, and the lining would need to be completely replaced. Even if we worked around the clock, we couldn't have it ready." I drove home in a daze, trying to figure out how to tell Michael that his sister had sabotaged our wedding. When I walked into our apartment, he took one look at my face and knew something was wrong. "What happened?" he asked, pulling me into his arms. I told him everything, about the destroyed dress, about Veronica's visit to the bridal shop, about the fake phone number, and the calculated timing. I watched his face go through a series of emotions, disbelief, anger, and finally a grim resignation that suggested this wasn't entirely surprising to him. "I'll kill her," he said quietly. "I will literally kill her. Michael, we need to focus on finding a solution. The wedding is in 2 days." "No, Charlotte. We need to focus on the fact that my sister deliberately tried to destroy our wedding. This isn't just sabotage, this is psychotic." He tried calling Veronica, but her phone was still turned off. He called his parents, but they said she'd been staying at Emma's apartment and they hadn't heard from her since the night before. Emma's phone was also going straight to voicemail. "They're avoiding us," Michael said grimly. "They know exactly what they've done." That evening, I managed to find a replacement dress at a high-end boutique that stayed open late for emergencies. It wasn't what I'd dreamed of. It was simpler, less detailed, and cost twice as much as my original dress. But it was beautiful and it fit. Michael insisted on paying for it himself, apologizing over and over for his sister's behavior. "I should have seen this coming," he said as we drove home from the boutique. "I should have known she'd try something like this. You couldn't have predicted this, Michael. This is beyond normal sibling rivalry." "No, it's not. I've been blind to how bad her obsession with Emma has gotten. I thought she was just being protective of her friend, but this is something else entirely." That night, Michael made a decision that surprised me. Instead of confronting Veronica directly, he called his mother and told her exactly what had happened. I listened to his side of the conversation, watching his expression grow more and more grim. "I don't care what her reasons were, Mom. She destroyed Charlotte's wedding dress 2 days before our wedding. That's not sisterly concern, that's deliberate cruelty." There was a long pause while Margaret spoke. "No, Mom, I'm not overreacting, and I'm not postponing the wedding. If Ronnie wants to act like a child, she can deal with the consequences like an adult." When he hung up, Michael looked exhausted. "Mom wants to talk to Ronnie before she makes any judgments. She says there might be some misunderstanding." "What kind of misunderstanding involves cutting up someone's wedding dress?" "Exactly what I said. But apparently Ronnie finally came home tonight, And she's claiming she never went to the bridal shop. She says someone must be impersonating her. I stared at him in disbelief. She's lying. I know she's lying. You know she's lying. The question is whether my parents are willing to see it. Friday night, the night before our wedding, I barely slept. I kept thinking about Veronica, wondering what else she might try to sabotage. Would she show up at the ceremony and object? Would she try to cause a scene at the reception? Would she find some other way to ruin what should have been the happiest day of my life? Michael was equally restless, tossing and turning beside me. Finally, around midnight, he got up and started pacing around our bedroom. I keep thinking about all the times she's done things like this, he said. Smaller things I brushed off because she's my sister. The time she accidentally deleted your contact information from the family group chat. The time she told everyone you were allergic to shellfish when you're not, so Mom made a completely different dinner for your birthday. The time she scheduled Emma's birthday party for the same night as your work event so I'd have to choose between them. She's been planning this for months, I realized. Maybe longer. This isn't just about the dress. She's been trying to drive us apart since the beginning. And I let her. I made excuses for her because I didn't want to deal with family drama. I'm so sorry, Charlotte. I should have protected you from this. You couldn't have known it would go this far. But I should have taken it seriously when you told me she was making you uncomfortable. I should have set boundaries with my family from the beginning. Saturday morning dawned bright and clear, perfect weather for an outdoor wedding. I got ready at my maid of honor's house, surrounded by my closest friends and my mother, trying to focus on the joy of the day instead of the anxiety churning in my stomach. My replacement dress was beautiful, and with professional hair and makeup, I looked every bit the radiant bride I'd always dreamed of being. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something else was going to go wrong. The ceremony was scheduled for 4 o'clock in the afternoon, with photos beforehand and cocktail hour immediately following. As we arrived at the botanical garden, I scanned the crowd of arriving guests, looking for Veronica's blonde head among the wedding attendees. I spotted Michael's parents near the entrance, greeting relatives and family friends, but there was no sign of his sister. Maybe she's not coming, my maid of honor Jessica said hopefully. Maybe she knows she went too far and decided to stay away. But as we were doing final touch-ups in the bridal suite, Margaret Matthews knocked on the door and asked to speak with me privately. She looked tired and older than I'd ever seen her, with dark circles under her eyes and a strained expression that suggested she'd been dealing with family drama all morning. "Charlotte, dear," she said once we were alone, "I owe you an apology." I wasn't sure what to say, so I just waited for her to continue. "I found out what really happened with your dress," she said quietly. "Veronica finally admitted it to me this morning. She did destroy it. On purpose." The admission hit me like a physical blow, even though I'd known it was true. Hearing it confirmed by Michael's mother somehow made it more real, more painful. "Why?" I asked. "Why would she do something so cruel?" Margaret sighed deeply, looking every one of her 62 years. "Because she's been in love with the idea of Emma being her sister-in-law for so long that she couldn't accept reality. She convinced herself that if she could just get rid of you, Michael would realize he was supposed to be with Emma. That's not love, Mrs. Matthews, that's obsession." "You're right, and I'm ashamed that I enabled it for so long. I made Emma feel like she was part of our family, and I let Veronica believe that Michael's future was something she could control. I never corrected her when she talked about Michael and Emma getting together someday, and I never shut down her schemes to push them together. I thought it was harmless, just a young girl playing matchmaker for her friend." "It was never harmless," I said quietly. "It was always cruel to Emma, making her think she had a chance when Michael never saw her that way. And it was cruel to me, making me feel like an outsider in the family I was marrying into. I know. And I'm going to make this right, Charlotte. Today. In front of everyone." Before I could ask what she meant, there was another knock on the door. Jessica poked her head in to tell us it was time for the ceremony to begin. As we walked toward the garden where our guests were waiting, Margaret squeezed my hand. "You look beautiful, dear," she said. "And I want you to know that you're exactly the daughter-in-law I hoped Michael would find." I just forgot that for a while. The ceremony itself was perfect. Michael looked incredibly handsome in his navy suit, and his face lit up when he saw me walking down the aisle. My father walked me to the altar with tears in his eyes, and when he placed my hand in Michael's, I felt like everything was exactly as it should be. We'd written our own vows, and Michael's words were so beautiful that half the guests were crying by the time he finished. When the officiant pronounced us husband and wife and Michael kissed me, I felt like the luckiest woman in the world. It wasn't until we were taking photos after the ceremony that I realized Veronica still hadn't appeared. I mentioned it to Michael during a brief break between family groupings. "She's here," he said grimly. "I saw her during the ceremony, sitting in the back with Emma, but I don't think she's planning to come to the reception. Maybe that's for the best. Maybe. But Mom asked me to trust her to handle the situation. She said she had a plan." I didn't have time to ask what kind of plan because the photographer was calling us back for more pictures. But as we posed with various combinations of family members and friends, I noticed Margaret having intense, whispered conversations with several relatives, including Michael's aunts and uncles who had traveled from out of state for the wedding. The reception venue was a 10-minute drive from the garden, and by the time we arrived for our grand entrance, the cocktail hour was already in full swing. Our guests had enjoyed appetizers and drinks while we finished taking photos, and everyone seemed to be in a festive mood. The historic mansion was decorated exactly as I'd envisioned, with ivory and gold linens, cascading floral arrangements, and twinkling lights that made everything look magical. We did our first dance to At Last by Etta James, and I felt like I was floating in Michael's arms. This was everything I dreamed of, a perfect wedding day with the man I loved, surrounded by friends and family who cared about us. But as we moved into the dinner portion of the evening, I noticed some commotion near the entrance to the ballroom. Margaret was escorting someone toward the head table, and as they got closer, I realized it was Veronica, looking pale and uncomfortable in a dark green dress that seemed to drain all the color from her face. Behind her, Emma Rodriguez followed reluctantly. I'd only met Emma a few times before, but she'd always seemed sweet and gentle, nothing like the manipulative femme fatale I'd imagined based on Veronica's constant references to her perfection. Tonight, she looked mortified, as if she'd rather be anywhere else in the world. Margaret approached the microphone that had been set up for speeches and tapped it lightly to get everyone's attention. The chatter in the room gradually died down as our guests turned to face her. "Good evening, everyone," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the sound system. "I hope you're all enjoying this beautiful celebration of Michael and Charlotte's marriage. Before we continue with dinner, I have something important to say." I looked at Michael in confusion, but he seemed as surprised as I was. This wasn't part of our planned program. "As many of you know," Margaret continued, "our family has been through some challenges recently. Some of you may have noticed that not everyone has been as welcoming to Charlotte as they should have been. I want to address that publicly, because this wonderful woman deserves an apology, and our family deserves to know the truth." The room was completely silent now, with nearly 100 guests hanging on Margaret's every word. I could feel my face burning with embarrassment, but I couldn't look away. "Yesterday, someone deliberately destroyed Charlotte's wedding dress, trying to sabotage her special day out of jealousy and spite. That someone was my daughter, Veronica." Gasps echoed through the ballroom. I heard Michael's sharp intake of breath beside me, and I reached for his hand under the table. Veronica had gone completely white, staring at her mother in shock. "I'm not sharing this to humiliate my daughter," Margaret continued, "but because actions have consequences, and Charlotte deserves to have her wedding day restored to the joy it should have been. Veronica has been under the mistaken impression that her brother was supposed to marry someone else, her friend Emma, and she took it upon herself to try to prevent this marriage from happening." Margaret gestured toward Emma, who looked like she wanted to disappear into the floor. "I want everyone to know that Emma had nothing to do with this. She has never encouraged Veronica's behavior, and she has repeatedly asked her to stop interfering in Michael's relationships. Emma is a lovely young woman who deserves better than to be used as a weapon in someone else's fantasy." The silence in the room was deafening. I could see relatives exchanging glances, friends leaning forward in their seats, everyone trying to process what they were hearing. "Veronica," Margaret said, turning to face her daughter directly, "you have something to say to Charlotte and Michael." For a moment I thought Veronica might refuse. She stood frozen beside the head table, her face cycling through emotions: shame, anger, defiance, and finally resignation. When she spoke, her voice was barely audible even with the microphone system. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm sorry for destroying your dress. I'm sorry for trying to ruin your wedding. I'm sorry for making you feel unwelcome in our family." Louder, Margaret said firmly. Everyone deserves to hear this. Veronica cleared her throat and spoke again, stronger this time. I said I'm sorry. I was wrong to interfere with your relationship and I was wrong to damage your property. I let my feelings about Emma cloud my judgment, and I acted like a spoiled child instead of a grown woman. The apology felt forced and incomplete, but it was more than I'd ever expected to get from her. Margaret nodded approvingly and took the microphone back. Thank you, Veronica. Now, I want everyone here to know that Charlotte is exactly the daughter-in-law I hoped Michael would find. She's kind, talented, intelligent, and she makes my son happier than I've ever seen him. I was foolish to let old expectations and misguided loyalty interfere with embracing her as part of our family. Margaret raised her champagne glass, and gradually every other guest in the room did the same. To Michael and Charlotte, she said, "May your marriage be filled with all the love, respect, and happiness you both deserve, and may our family be stronger for having learned this difficult lesson about acceptance and letting go of the past." The toast that followed was thunderous, with every guest in the room raising their glasses and calling out congratulations. As people began to sit back down and return to their conversations, I felt tears streaming down my face, not tears of sadness or embarrassment, but tears of relief and gratitude. Margaret came over to our table and leaned down to hug me tightly. "I'm so sorry it took me so long to do the right thing," she whispered in my ear. "But I promise you, from now on, you'll never question whether you belong in this family." Michael was staring at his mother with something like awe. "Mom, I can't believe you just did that. It needed to be done," she said simply. "And it needed to be done publicly, so there could be no misunderstandings about where this family stands going forward." The rest of the reception was everything I dreamed it would be. The food was delicious, the music was perfect, and our guests danced and celebrated late into the night. Veronica and Emma left shortly after the public apology, but their absence only made the party feel lighter and more joyful. During the father-daughter dance, my dad whispered to me, "I was worried about you marrying into a family with so much drama, but after tonight, I think you're going to be just fine. Your mother-in-law has more backbone than I gave her credit for." During our last dance as newlyweds, Michael pulled me close and spoke quietly in my ear. "I love you so much, Charlotte, and I'm so proud that you're my wife. I promise you, nothing like this will ever happen again." "I love you too," I said. "And I love your family. Even Veronica, believe it or not. She's hurt and confused, but maybe now she can start to heal. You're a better person than I am. I'm not sure I can forgive her as easily as you seem to. You don't have to forgive her right away, but she's your sister, and someday, when she's ready to genuinely make amends, I hope you'll give her a chance." 3 months after our wedding, Veronica sent me a handwritten letter. Not an email or a text, but an actual letter on cream-colored stationery. In it, she apologized again, more thoroughly and thoughtfully than she had at the reception. She explained that she'd been in therapy since the wedding, working through her issues with control and her tendency to live vicariously through other people's relationships. She also mentioned that Emma had moved to Seattle for a new job and was dating someone she'd met through work, a relationship that had nothing to do with anyone named Matthews. Emma was happy, Veronica wrote, happier than she'd been in years because she was finally free to pursue her own life instead of waiting for someone who was never going to love her the way she wanted. The letter ended with a request. Would I be willing to meet for coffee sometime, just the two of us, so she could apologize properly and try to start over? I showed the letter to Michael, who read it with a mixture of skepticism and hope. "What do you think?" he asked. "I think people can change," I said. "And I think your sister deserves a chance to prove that she's learned from her mistakes." 6 months after our wedding, Veronica and I had that coffee date. It was awkward at first, with long pauses and careful conversation. But by the end of our meeting, I could see glimpses of the person she might have been if she hadn't spent so many years consumed by jealousy and misplaced loyalty. She told me about her therapy sessions, about recognizing the patterns of behavior she'd learned from watching too many romantic comedies where persistence and manipulation were portrayed as romantic gestures. She talked about how she'd confused Emma's quiet longing for Michael with her own need to control the narrative of her family's future. "I turned Emma into a project," she admitted. "I thought if I could just make her dreams come true, I'd be the hero of her story. But I wasn't listening to what she actually wanted, and I definitely wasn't considering what Michael wanted. Or what you wanted. What do you want, Veronica?" I asked. "Not for Emma, not for Michael, not for your parents. What do you want for yourself? It was a question she'd apparently never considered seriously before, and she stared into her coffee cup for a long time before answering. I want to be someone worth having as a sister-in-law, she said finally. I want to be someone you'd choose to spend time with, not someone you tolerate because I'm married to your brother. You're not married to my brother, I pointed out with a small smile. I'm married to your brother, she laughed, the first genuine laugh I'd ever heard from her. Right. I want to be someone you'd choose to spend time with, not someone you tolerate because you're married to my brother. That coffee date was the beginning of a slow but steady rebuilding of our relationship. It took time, months of careful conversations, small gestures of goodwill, and gradual trust building. But eventually, Veronica became not just my sister-in-law, but my friend. A year after our wedding, she met someone of her own. A quiet, thoughtful man named David who worked at the local library and shared her newfound interest in personal growth and self-reflection. Watching her in a healthy relationship was like seeing her become a completely different person, someone who channeled her protective instincts and passionate nature into building something positive instead of tearing something down. 2 years after our wedding, Margaret asked me to help plan Veronica's engagement party. As we worked together on decorations and menu planning, she shook her head in amazement. I never thought I'd see the day when my daughters would be planning a party together, she said. Your daughters? I repeated, surprised by the phrasing. Well, of course. You're my daughter now, Charlotte. You have been since the day you married Michael, but it took me far too long to show you that. As I sit here now, 3 years married and blissfully happy, I sometimes think about how different things could have been if Margaret hadn't found the courage to confront the truth publicly at our wedding reception. Veronica's sabotage could have driven a permanent wedge between Michael and his family. Or worse, it could have succeeded in breaking us apart. Instead, her desperate attempt to destroy our happiness became the catalyst for our family to finally deal with years of unspoken expectations and misplaced priorities. Margaret's decision to choose truth over family diplomacy, to choose love over convenience, transformed what could have been an ongoing source of pain into an opportunity for genuine growth and healing. Emma sent us a Christmas card this year with a photo of her and her boyfriend hiking in the mountains outside Seattle. She looked radiant and free, no longer carrying the weight of unrequited love or her friends' misguided schemes. In her note, she thanked us for helping her realize that she deserved to be someone's first choice, not their consolation prize. Michael and I are stronger than ever, our relationship tested by fire and proven to be unbreakable. We've learned to communicate more openly about family dynamics and to set boundaries when necessary. But we've also learned the value of forgiveness and second chances. And Veronica? She's become one of my closest friends, someone I can call when I need advice or just want to laugh about something ridiculous. She's also become Michael's sister again, not the manipulative, controlling person she was during those dark months, but the funny, loyal, fiercely protective woman she was always capable of being. Sometimes the greatest gift you can receive is the truth, even when it comes wrapped in conflict and delivered at the most inconvenient possible moment. My wedding day taught me that real love isn't just about the romance between two people. It's about the courage to choose what's right over what's easy, to choose growth over comfort, and to choose hope over fear. I learned that families aren't just born, they're built, through difficult conversations and painful admissions and the willingness to start over when you've gotten it wrong. I learned that forgiveness isn't about forgetting what happened, but about choosing to believe that people can change, that tomorrow can be better than yesterday, that love really can conquer all, even the most determined attempts to destroy it. Most importantly, I learned that sometimes the people who try hardest to hurt us are the ones who end up teaching us the most about our own strength, our own capacity for grace, and our own ability to transform pain into wisdom. My wedding dress may have been destroyed, but my wedding day was perfect, not because everything went according to plan, but because truth finally won out over deception, love conquered fear, and a family found its way back to each other. And that, I realized, was worth more than any dress could ever be.